Hi guys, this is day 8 of our 42-day revision challenge, and today we're doing price elasticity of supply. So what is price elasticity of supply? It's the responsiveness of quantity supplied to a change in price. When the price is going up, quantity supplied goes up, and we know this that supply curve is upward sloping. So we've done this before as well. We've said that like when you look at supply curve is upward sloping. When the price of a good goes up, quantity supplied goes up. So what PES tells us is by how much will quantity supplied go up by. For example, let's say if price is going up by 10% and quantity is going up by, let's say, 20%, we can say the PES is going to be 20% over 10% or 2. So 20% over 10% is going to be 2. So what does PES tell us? It tells us how responsive quantity supplied will be, to a change in price. Now, because the supply curve is upward sloping, we know this that whenever price of a good goes up, quantity supplied goes up. Because supply curve is upward sloping, we say that PES will always be positive. So when we look at PES, the value of PES is always positive. But we also say this, that the value of PES ranges from 0 to infinity. And there's a positive one here as well. So if you are looking at a value of 0, we call it perfectly inelastic supply. But if you look at a value of infinity, we call it perfectly elastic supply. And in between, the one would be what we call a unitary elastic supply, where PES is equal to 1. Now, between 0 and 1 is your inelastic or relatively inelastic supply, while in this zone it's a relatively elastic supply. Again, as we discussed in PED, when your supply is perfectly inelastic, it is not at all responsive to a change in price. For us, basically, when you have a supply curve which is not at all responsive to a change in price, we call it sometimes fixed supply. Irrespective of what the price is, the supply is fixed. Like a supply in a stadium would be perfectly inelastic, irrespective of what the price is. The stadium capacity is fixed like this one. So irrespective of what the price will be, like if the demand goes up, the price may go up, but the supply is fixed here. So it originates basically from the quantity axis, but it's a completely vertical line. An example could be your sort of stadium seat capacity. Similarly, when you have what we call a relatively inelastic supply curve, if we focus on the relatively inelastic supply curve, this is where the response is not that much. We always say if it's a linear supply curve, which is coming from if it's a linear supply curve and it's inelastic, it will always come from the quantity axis. So I'm going to make a linear supply curve, but I'm going to make it come from the quantity axis. So this is supply curve which comes from the quantity axis. So that's the first feature we need to know. Number 2, we need to know that in this case, your percentage change in quantity supplied is less than percentage change in price. And as a result of this, for this kind of a supply curve, what we say is that PES is less than 1, but more than 0, of course. An important thing that I want to explain here, and we need to remember this, that when you look at a relatively inelastic supply curve, although we say that PES is less than 1, but we also say this, that if you keep on increasing prices, let's say from P0 to P1 to, for example, P2, if you keep on increasing prices, you will realize this, that the elasticity of supply will actually go up. So what we say is that although PES is less than 1, but as quantity or price rises, PES will rise. The good will become more and more responsive or elastic to a change in price. Because the price goes up, producer will become more and more responsive to a change in price. When it comes to now the unitary elastic supply curve, this is where the supply curve is kind of like equally responsive to a change in price. So here we say percentage change in quantity supplied is equal to percentage change in price. So producers are responding in an equal and opposite manner, which is where our supply curve will actually come from the origin. So if I draw my supply curve that comes from the origin, this is my price, this is my quantity. If I have supply curve like, for example, S1, or supply curve like, for example, S2, or for that matter S3, all of these supply curves, they are coming from the origin. So if the supply curves, let me write this, if the supply curves originate from the origin, it has a PES equal to 1. So all these three curves, S1, S2, S3, despite being flat or more steep, has the same elasticity. PES is equal to 1. So that's one thing important to know. And also one more thing important to know is that, like in the last case when we did this case, which was a relatively sort of inelastic curve, we said as price goes up, PES goes up. But here, PES is constant. So let me write this here. PES is constant for our relatively or unitary inelastic case. Okay, so I have a little space here, so now let me just move on and write about relatively elastic supply. So when we look at relatively elastic supply, let's move on here. So for the relatively elastic supply curve, we draw a supply curve that comes from the price axis. So in this case, if it's a linear supply curve and it's relatively elastic, then we say it must come from the price axis. Which means that when you look at this kind of a curve, the percentage change in quantity supplied will be greater than percentage change in price, and that's exactly why your PES is greater than 1. Now, one more important thing to remember is that when the supply curve is coming from the price axis, we know it's elastic, but we also need to know that as price goes up, PES actually goes down. So in this kind of a case, whenever it's very elastic, you will see that as the price go up, your quantity supplied will actually your quantity supplied, your PES will actually fall. The responsiveness is actually falling. It will not become inelastic, but the PES value will keep on declining. So in this case, need to remember this, that PES is not constant. So just like inelastic supply curve, PES is not constant, even in elastic supply curve, PES is not constant. The last case we want to do is that of what we call a perfectly elastic supply. Perfectly elastic supply is majorly true for world supply. When you look at world supply of any good, a producer that is supplying to the whole world, he supplies at a particular price, and that supply curve will look like a perfectly horizontal supply curve. Now this means that at the price P0, any quantity can be produced by the producer without any problem. So this is my supply curve, this is quantity and price. So my supply curve is perfectly horizontal, which means any quantity can be produced at P naught. So without any trouble, any quantity can be produced at P naught. So the producer can make infinitely large amount, and that's why PES is infinity. Will he produce any amount when the price goes below P naught? And the answer is no. And he is not getting any price above P naught too. So even though your demand can go up, the price isn't changing, for example, in this case. So perfectly elastic supply curve is a case where the producer has a very, very large capacity, easily able to make any rise in demand without any change in cost. The next thing we want to discuss when it comes to supply curve is basically what are the factors that affect PES. So let's talk about factors or determinants of PES. The major determinant of PES, what we say, is the crucial one that makes the producer to become more responsive to change in cost is what we say flexibility. Flexibility is basically how easy is it for the producer to increase supply when the price goes up. Now, if it's very difficult for the producer to increase supply when the price goes up, we say he is inflexible. And that inflexibility basically means that if the price goes up, and if I want to increase my quantity supplied, and I'm inflexible as a producer, then I may need to basically inflexible as a producer, I may need to incur a large cost. So a large cost has to be incurred to increase my quantity supplied. So if you are inflexible as a producer, when the price goes up, you want to increase quantity supplied, but if it's difficult for you to do so, then you may need to incur a large cost to increase quantity supplied. On the other hand, if you are increasing price and it's easy to increase quantity supply, then we are basically flexible, and that would mean a relatively small rise in cost will take place. Let me give an example. Let's say if I'm a producer and I can easily, for example, increase my quantity because I have, let's say, unused capacity. So the factor that gives you flexibility is basically unused capacity. So if I have unused capacity, do I need to incur more cost in order to increase my output? And the answer is no, because if I have unused capacity, then I can easily increase my output without incurring much cost, because I will use my unemployed resources to start off with. Similarly, if I have resources or inputs which are very mobile, so if I have mobile factors of production, what are mobile factors of production? Mobile factors of production means those factors of production which can easily be used for one thing or another. For example, let's say if I have a teacher in my school who can teach maths and who can teach economics, so anytime there's a rise in demand for, let's say, economics, I can ask that teacher to teach more batches for economics. But let's say if there's a rise in demand for math, he can do the same for me for math. So if there's more flexibility in that manner, where the factors of production are easily mobile in alternative uses, I can easily increase supply by switching resources from one production to another. So mobility of factors of production is the second factor that can give more flexibility to producers, and that can also result in supply curve to become more elastic. So higher the flexibility, lower will be the rise in cost, and therefore higher will be the quantity supplied to a change in price. So you can see this kind of a curve which is elastic. For example, small change in price from P0 to, for example, P1 can lead to a large change in quantity supplied because producers are flexible to start off with. So first factor is basically flexibility, which is to link with cost and has two things in it: the unused capacity and mobile factors of production. The next factor that affects PES or elasticity of supply is to do with perishable versus non-perishable goods. So if the goods are perishable in nature, perishable versus non-perishable. So what are perishable goods? Perishable goods are those goods which cannot be stored. Why can't they be stored? Because they have a very small, what we call, shelf life, so they cannot be stored. And because they can't be stored, the supply tends to be very inelastic to a change in price. But non-perishable goods, like for example furniture, like for example anything that can be easily stored, this can be stored, is something which is very elastic in supply. And agricultural goods are examples of perishable goods which cannot be stored for long, and therefore they are inelastic in supply. In a way, it brings you to the same point that there's an inflexibility here because goods can't be stored. The third factor that makes elasticity to get affected is basically to do with time period. If I give a producer a longer time period, let's say long run, we will see the supply to become elastic. So elastic supply. Why will that be the case? Because the producer can easily increase his capacity, easily hire more labor, train more labor, and easily increase supply. So in the long run, supply tends to be more elastic because producer can easily increase production capacity. Similarly, in the short run, supply tends to be inelastic supply, and that's basically where you are looking at a producer who doesn't have enough time available to increase supply because it takes, for example, much time for the factors of production to be added, to be trained, to be employed to make more output. So short run supply tends to be inelastic, long run supply tends to be elastic. The last discussion we want to have is about the relevance of PES. The first important relevance of PES is that it tells us how much price or quantity will change if there's an increase in demand. So from a producer's perspective, let's say if the demand for a good goes up and he's selling an inelastic good, then for him the price will go up by much more to a change in the demand for the good. So if I have, let's say, perfectly inelastic good, let's say a stadium, right? And let's say there's a big match that is happening in the stadium, the demand suddenly will go up. Let's say if it's a Pakistan-India match, for example, the demand will go up much more, and the producer can make a higher sort of revenue because the supply is perfectly fixed or inelastic. On the other hand, if you have a perfectly elastic supply curve, even though the demand may go up, the producer's price will remain the same. In fact, here the PES will tell us how much the quantity the producer has to increase to meet the increased demand. So the usefulness of PES first is that it tells us how much price or quantity will change when the demand for a good change. Let's write that in terms of words, that number one, PES is useful in determining the extent to which quantity or price changes to a change in demand. So from a producer perspective, that is an important knowledge to have. Knowledge of PAS is also useful when it comes to tax policy. So, for example, if the supply is very elastic and the producer is put a tax, then the tax burden will fall more on the consumers, because having an elastic supply means the producer can easily respond to a change in price. He's got very flexible supply, and that's why the tax burden falls more on the consumer than on the producer. On the other hand, if the supply is very inelastic, for example, let's say supply for so your a stadium, or which has a fixed capacity, supply is very inelastic, then producer has to produce that good, and therefore if you put a tax on that producer, it will fall on the producer rather than consumer. So the more inelastic, so number 2, more inelastic the supply, higher will be the tax burden on producers. So producers, knowing that if they're selling inelastic good, taxes will affect them more. But producer, knowing that they're producing elastic good, know that the tax burden will fall more on the consumer.